The next enlightenment tip, in Tibetan it's called Koravangемig Samba, or contemplating the shortcomings of samsara. Samsara here really means going in circles rather than high to higher. As Nagarjuna put it, the great Indian 2nd century master, father of the Madhyamaka, and often also called the great chariot path opener of the Mahayana, as he put it, that most people, although born in the human realm and having the great potential for enlightenment, rather than evolve upward, either just take one step forward and one step back, or they take one step forward and 2 steps back, or even worse. So korawa in Tibetan, for samsara, literally means going in circles. And it refers to living a life where we're always taking what comes from the past and essentially just regurgitating it, just responding to it and reliving it in the same old patterns. Often in samsara they talk about the 6 realms, the hells, the ghost realms, the animal realms, the human realms, the asura realms, and the deva realms. Whether one thinks of these as outer or inner isn't especially important. There are peoples who prefer both ways of thinking. On an inner level, the hells refer to a mind of anger and violence, always locked in anger and violence, irritation and frustration. It's a kind of a hellish life. And because of living a life of anger and violence, one becomes surrounded by anger and violence. One attracts angry and violent people, and so on and so forth. So one goes round and round the circle of anger and violence. Where does anger come from? As we saw in the previous contemplation on karma, cause and effect, wherever we are today is a result of our evolution in the past, and whatever we find in our lap at the present moment is a wave left from the past. So we have our choice of how we deal with that material. So as Tibetan saying goes, look at your physical reality, you see your past lives. Look at your motivation, your inner motivation, and you see what's in the future. So in this sense, Buddhism doesn't believe in predestiny, as some peoples in some traditions do, nor in an omnipotent God who throws all of this stuff at you or on you, or curses and whatnot of shamans and spirits, as some traditions do. But rather, what comes into your lap is of your own making, and how you handle it, how you treat it, how you process it, is of your own making. So the hope in the Buddhist tradition, in the Dharma tradition, is that if we apply, as I mentioned in the previous session, the Lakpe Labasum, the 3 higher trainings of ethical approach and daily meditation, or strengthening the inner contemplative muscle, if you will. And finally, prajna, or a monitoring of your consciousness, so you're actually aware of the conscious content rather than just the world around you. If you can apply those 3, what falls into your lap is therefore transformable. It becomes, and if we don't do that, then whatever falls in your lap, you just immediately respond to it in the same old way. So some condition agitating anger and violence falls into your lap. And if you don't have those 3 trainings, if you don't have those 3 basic spiritual tools, you'll just be set off, like your buttons will be pushed, and almost in automatic reaction, the same thing will get repeated. And that's the meaning of samsara. Same old, going round and round. What comes from the past falls now. You treat it or respond to it in an unskillful way, or an unwise way, or an unthinking way, an unconscious way. And essentially the same pattern just gets repeated and repeated and repeated. So it's a little bit like a train on a circuit which has only one track it can go on. And although there may be various track switches along the way of the train, none of those switches are ever operating. So you just go round and round. And the same with the ghost realms. We can think external or internal, as Shantideva puts it. These are things, the real ghost is the inner ghost of your own greed, your own attachments. Because of your greed and attachments, you always have craving and clinging. In iconography, the hungry ghosts are often shown with a very, very thin neck and a very big belly. So it doesn't matter how much they encounter, they are never satisfied. They can never eat fast enough to satisfy their hunger, because their neck is very thin and their belly is very big. The 7th Dalai Lama put it once in a poem. He said, "There's no one quite so poor as a greedy person." And the word he uses for a greedy person is actually like a greedy millionaire or billionaire. That greedy in Tibetan is like the sense of the word is a very wealthy person. A wealthy person with greed is like the hungry ghost. They're never satisfied, so they're always hungry. And always being hungry is, in a way, a real condition of poverty. In another poem, the 7th Dalai Lama says, "There's no one quite so wealthy as a person with the wealth of the happy mind, or the content mind." The word for content mind in Tibetan, chokshe. The understanding that the universe is always enough. Whatever is there at the present moment, it's enough for the present moment. When we look into the past or we look into the future, then we can stretch our wants and desires and needs. But there's no end to wanting to stretch when we start doing that. Otherwise, if we have chokshe, the mind of the universe is enough, the world is enough. I think it's, if we look at Christianity, who, as I mentioned earlier, Christ borrowed a lot of ideas from the Buddha. In one of his passages, he says, "God takes care of the birds of the heavens." Why would he not take care of humans? So we see birds walking around, and they've always got enough. Of course, there'll be times when they're a little bit hungry, but on the other hand, a little bit of hunger is kind of healthy. There's many studies that show that occasional periods of fasting is good for health. Occasional periods of dehydration are good for health. In the Tibetan world or the Buddhist world, often for 2 weeks out of a year, they'll go 8 days where one day they have one meal and drink lots of liquid, and the next day have no food and no liquid, as a kind of both a spiritual healing and also a physical healing. Originally in India, this was used as a cure for many diseases that at the time were thought to be incurable. For instance, the great female Bhikshuni, Bhikshuni Sri was her name, an 11th century nun, made the practice very famous when she contracted leprosy, and did that practice. Tibetans call it nyungne, and cured herself of leprosy. But it was a well-known leprosy cure at a time when there was no known other cure for leprosy, as well as many other diseases. So when we say the world is enough, it doesn't mean you won't occasionally have a few things that would be nice to have. You may sometimes miss a meal. You may sometimes miss a cup of coffee. But should that be a reason to live a life of hoarding? My great-great-grandmother was a Micmac Indian, which is we used to think of them as a sub-tribe of the Iroquois, though they don't think of them that these days under the politicization of the native cultures of North America. In their tradition, greed and hoarding was actually considered a mental illness. It was considered a very serious disease. So the same thing in the Buddhist world, where we think of the hungry ghost, this having a very little neck and a very big belly. We have an expression in the West, sometimes eyes are bigger than your stomach. Someone fills their plate, they want more, then the ability to eat it all, of course, becomes a problem. Dalai Lama once put it that the world today, we don't suffer from a lack of resources. Hunger in the world isn't caused by a lack of resources or a lack of food. Is caused by inefficient ways of distribution of resources. And he doesn't point the finger directly at hoarding as one of those causes, but for me, that's one of the distinct causes, is the hoarders make a big problem through their mental illness of greed. And of course, that's a political issue, how you solve that, or if it's a mental issue, just give them some counseling, something like that. Send them to the shrinks, as we used to say where I grew up. But the problem with greed is it doesn't matter what one has, one wants more, and so one always has a dissatisfied mind. So out of that dissatisfaction comes a dissatisfied mind, and then making decisions on the basis of a dissatisfied mind make for an unsatisfactory solution, causing korawa, or going round and round in circles. The cycle of samsara. Another problem is that humans are creatures of habit. When we develop the habit of anger, then it becomes normal, and then we just perpetuate it. When we develop the habit of greed, it just becomes a lifestyle. And that, again, has a self-perpetuating effect. The seventh Dalai Lama, again, my favorite, I put it this way in a poem: see your body as a boat borrowed for a few years, a boat with which you can row yourself to the jewel island of enlightenment. See all possessions as things borrowed to be given back. And so in the time in which you have control of them or possess them, use them to benefit the world. Otherwise, if we just set up this self-perpetuating cycle, it becomes like a ghostly existence. Humans, I think this negative side of humanity is the arrogance of humans. So this is specified by Nagarjuna and by other great writers, inspired by the words of the Buddha, that in the human realm we have the possibility of greatness, but we just assume, because we have thumbs and a little bit of a bigger brain, that we can use those thumbs to fashion tools with which to dominate other species and destroy the environment and so forth. We can use our 5-point higher IQ to outsmart others and trick them and use them and abuse them, other species. If instead of that, and when we do that, of course, we just set up a self-perpetuating cycle of misery for ourselves and for those around us. When we mistreat the environment, it comes back to harm us. When we mistreat other species, it comes back to harm us. When we mistreat other humans, it comes back to harm us. So often we think humans are somehow very noble. So we do have advantage of thumbs and a little bit of a better, higher brain, so we can go toward enlightenment. But in reality, most humans don't. If we look at the history of humanity. Slavery was one of the most popular forms of wealth for many, many centuries in many, many cultures. Gets a lot of traction in North America because of the American buying and selling of black peoples until the early 1800s, 1804, the import of blacks was made illegal. But until 1804, they were even imported and sold. Of course, it came to an end in the 1860s. But many, many cultures throughout the world, from Greece to India to China, over the centuries, one of the largest, the best forms of wealth was actually catching and enslaving other humans. It's not that noble. It's not that noble. It's not using the human brain or human thumbs to the best of their ability. And even today, humans don't behave that well, 90% of humans. Just the way we enslave animals and in the worst of conditions. And that's not to say Buddhists shouldn't eat meat or don't eat meat. And Buddha ate meat. But the emphasis has always been on kind of basic human rights in the animal world. And Tibetans followed that by not allowing the killing of any wild animals, from fish to deer to insects. Only doctors could kill animals for medical purposes, but that was less than probably 1/10 of 1% of the population was allowed to do that. Early Canadians traveling in Canada, this guy called Ferguson, when I read his journal of when he traveled across the eastern Tibet, he said it was great hunting. You could walk up to the gazelles because they had no fear of humans, because humans never hunted them, and just walk up to the biggest one and just blast them. It was great hunting. So he was a very intelligent man and a very good man, but on the other hand, we humans have this blind spot of arrogance, which tends to be our downcoming. So arrogance, as one of the 6 realms, is an outer realm of the arrogance of humans and the way they treat the environment, other species, and even other humans. For instance, today, the 5% very wealthy largely are very wealthy because of the 40% very poor on the planet. And those 40% very poor are kind of economic slaves. It's an arrogant way to run a planet. It's an arrogant way to run a household. It's an arrogant way to run a village or a city or any other community. Animals in the world of 6 realms are considered their shortcoming as they're not as clever in many ways as some of the other species. And by nature, they live by largely eating one another, and so they have a lot of problems, in a certain amount of problems in their life, certain amount of sufferings in their life. But in terms of the spiritual side of that, from Samsara, it's talking about living on instinct or living without mindfulness, because when one does that, again, it's just a self-perpetuating cycle. Whatever falls into your lap just gets replayed in the same key and with the same notes and in the same patterns. So life just gets relived again and again and again without any improvement. As not to say no animals can improve, that's not the point. But the point is, when we live without mindfulness and without applying the 3 trainings of ethics and meditation and higher consciousness or wisdom, then we tend to just replay. And the same with the other realms. So the final preliminary in these traditions coming from Atisha and through Marpa, the early Kargyupas and Kadampas, and into the Sakyupas, and then into the Gelugpas, and then, of course, later spreading into the Nyingma, starting with the joy of being alive, the importance of relying upon a spiritual master, and contemplating one's own mortality and the fragility of life. and contemplating the nature of karmic cause and effect. And finally, this point of the unsatisfactory nature of samsara, of walking in circles. Some of the literature goes on to say that if you die in a state of anger, then you easily can take rebirth in hell. If you die in a state of desire or greed, you can take rebirth as a ghost. Die in a state of lack of mindfulness, you can take rebirth as an animal. Die in a state of arrogance, you can reborn as a human with negative conditions. And as we look at planet Earth today, maybe 20% of humans live with positive conditions. The other 80% have mainly negative conditions, struggling just to survive and pay the bills and feed their kids and send their kids to college and this sort of stuff. Die in a state of jealousy, envy, reborn as an asura, and die in a state of pride or complacence or apathy, then as a lower deva. Better than that is to use the advantage of our thumbs and our higher brain to turn the pages of a book, read, learn, and become more spiritual, cultivate ethics, meditation, and higher consciousness, and eventually achieve, in the end, achieve enlightenment rather than just walk around and round in circles, or even worse, take one step forward and 2, 3, 4, 5, even 10 steps backward. I wish you luck with that.
tapçıllasını mırrın goldiğos mellili tinkin tellili tinkin benimi gittiği için yürüdü dülzite hittiri tirişin uvgun borlu hıngaydın uttagimin